Welcome, everyone, to the Cultivating Compassion Education series provided by Compassionate Care ALS. We are very fortunate and grateful tonight to have Dr. Archana Basu from the MGH ALS PACT team. Her topic tonight is speaking with your children about ALS. Dr. Basu is a psychologist in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and a research scientist in the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Along with Dr. Cindy Moore, who is along with us tonight. Welcome, Cindy. Dr. Basu is a psychologist in the MGH ALS PACT team. The ALS PACT program provides parent guidance to support parents in addressing the illness-related challenges faced by their children and adolescents. Welcome, Dr. Basu, and thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Thank you for this warm introduction, as well as this invitation to talk to your team and to this community. It's really an honor for me to present a part of what we do at the PACT program. And I'm really honored to present a little bit about our program on behalf of Dr. Cindy Moore and myself. So I'll go ahead and start screen share. Does that look okay? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that looks good.
Thank you. So thank you to the Compassionate Care ALS team for this invitation. You'll notice that the topic of my talk here is a little broader, and in part because I wanted to reflect that the PACT program, which is Parenting at a Challenging Time, which is part of the multidisciplinary team at MGH, focuses on a variety of things as part of our consultation with patients at MGH. A key part of that is focusing on communication with children. So as James rightly sort of said, a big part of this talk is on this common thread of how to communicate with children, why we feel it's important, and the ways in which we collaborate with parents and grandparents in helping them think through some of these communications with children. I do want to also note at the outset that I will be using the term parents throughout this talk, more for the sake of simplicity. But really, when we say parents and the PACT program, we are thinking about all adults who are consistently involved in caring for children. And so it may also include other adults, such as grandparents, or occasionally someone else in the family, such as an uncle or an aunt who was diagnosed with ALS. Doctors Moore and I have no financial disclosures to report. In today's talk, I will be talking about, I'll begin by just giving a brief history and overview of the PACT program with an introduction to why we focus on parenting-related support. And then, as I said, focus particularly on why communication and talking to children is so key to supporting them in a variety of ways. Finally, I'd like to briefly introduce a project that we are working on, which is to create some parent guidance materials funded by the ALS Find a Cure We Care initiative. I'd like to talk a little bit about the materials we are developing and welcome opportunity for your feedback if anyone's interested in looking at the materials and sharing their perspective on it. So the PACT program was established at MGH, Mass General Hospital, in 1998 in the Cancer Center. We have the MGH ALS PACT program builds on this long-standing program in the Cancer Center, but is relatively newer. We began collaborating with the ALS team at MGH through some limited consultations on a case-by-case basis over the past several years. And then in 2019, we were funded by the EGL Foundation to develop a more systematic program as it exists now. Our mission, as I noted, is to address the parenting concerns of adults with ALS who have children in their families, and therefore to collaborate with parents and grandparents to support their children's adjustment and resilience throughout the course of ALS. We are a program that is located in MGH, so we care for and collaborate with patients who are patients at Mass General Hospital, and we work with families who have children as young as infants, all the way through about emerging adults in their mid-20s. I did want to note that even though Dr. Moore and I are both psychologists, the PACT model is different in that from traditional therapy. We don't provide therapy either to parents or children, and typically do not meet children themselves. Instead, what we offer is a variety of educational consultations that draws upon what we know about child development, clinical psychology and therapy, family systems work, and it is really tailored to meet families sort of where they are and be flexible in that we are available on an as-needed basis to parents or grandparents. Sometimes in our initial consultations, particularly as we are getting to know families, our consultations may be 30 minutes to 45 minutes, or sometimes even an hour. And we will meet with parents and co-parents as they are comfortable. And then sometimes, it might be a single consult. Most of the times, we will continue to have a collaboration with parents, and we'll talk to them multiple times on an as-needed basis over many months. As we get to know families, it is not uncommon for us to sometimes get a request for a consult that might be limited to a very particular question, and the consult might be as short as 10 or 15 minutes. So it's not sort of traditional weekly psychotherapy as clinical psychologists often tend to do. Our goal is to support children's coping and adaptation, and sometimes it can be hard to imagine, but we do believe that even through some of the most compelling adversities, children can and do have the capacity to thrive throughout the course of a parent's illness. And our goal in our consults is to support that process through our collaboration with parents. And this builds on a very robust decades of research from a variety of disciplines, as I had noted before, that essentially shows that parents' attunement to their children's emotional and mental health and their needs can support their resilience even through very trying and difficult experiences. We also believe that parents are experts about their children. They know them well. And so we talk to parents and try to listen closely to their sort of general philosophy, any cultural or religious considerations, their child's own unique history and family history, to really tailor our guidance accordingly. Finally, as we all well know, parents can be passionate advocates for their children and are central to engaging the support of communities in support of their children and family. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the diagnosis of ALS, or really any serious and medical condition, will lead to a variety of adjustment and coping reactions. However, it is also important for us to note that, and this is perhaps most salient for parents to know, is that most children do not go on to develop serious mental health problems in response to a parent's illness. And by that, I mean that children don't go on to meet sort of full criteria for a diagnosable mental health conditions. So while many children will experience a variety of new or increased distress related reactions, we also know that the vast majority of children do not go on to have long-lasting serious mental health problems. These expected and understandable reactions as children adjust and cope can, manifest in a variety of ways. Certainly, they can look like worry, anxiety, or sadness. It might look like children are preoccupied. For many children, this can look like a range of, stomach aches or headaches or physical and somatic symptoms. Behavioral changes, such as either withdrawing or sometimes what looks like the opposite, which is sort of acting out. Studies have also documented that children with a parent with ALS may also experience lower self-esteem and a sense of isolation. One study in particular that was conducted by Dr. Kavanaugh, it's also where they interviewed adolescents, also, however, found that as children adjust to their parents' diagnosis, especially for adolescents and older children, they might be involved in helping to care for their parents. There might also be a range of mixed reactions, including feeling a sense of pride or efficacy in terms of being able to help a parent and their family and supporting the family's adjustment. So one of the things that we talk to parents about and often get questions about is, how do I know when to worry? How do I know when to seek additional professional mental health support? Should I involve the school in supporting my child's emotional adjustment? And so we certainly work with parents to help them understand the range of reactions and to recognize when some of these symptoms might either be consistently or persistently affecting their children. So typically what we see is that these distress-related reactions tend to ebb and flow. So there are certainly times when children present with more concerns relative to other times. But on the other hand, when there are children who, for more days consistently, say in a 2-week period or 3-week period, tend to have some of these reactions and adjustment related concerns, that also begin to interfere with their day-to-day functioning. So that could mean their capacity to engage in some of the academics or school-related activities, to play or have typical peer-related interactions that they were doing before. Perhaps if there are significant changes, such as losing interest in things that they enjoyed before, and that continues over many days, then that's when we would generally advise to consider a more detailed evaluation and perhaps seeking mental health support. Of course, we also recognize that having a mental health diagnosis is not the only or primary reason to seek mental health support. So there are certainly reasons to seek professional support for ongoing, monitoring and support as children and families adjust to a parent's illness. One of the other questions that we get as part of this, as part of our consultations, and perhaps the most common question, is about whether and when, and sometimes even why, parents might consider talking to their children about ALS. And as a program, and just sort of knowing what the research suggests, I do want to note that there's certainly no clear, established, or best or one correct approach to sharing information about a parent's illness with children. We draw from our consultations with families, as well as our collaborations with our multidisciplinary team members to offer guidance about that are evidence informed about why and when to communicate with children. That being said, the preponderance of evidence supports the idea that age-appropriate, transparent communication can help children to adjust better and cope better. I also want to note that some of the research that we reference is certainly from research that has been conducted with families where an adult has ALS, but we also broadly review and reference research from other serious or terminal medical conditions, because the body of research for ALS is relatively limited in some areas. And what we find is that when we look at research, for example, from families and children with a parent with cancer, for example, there is a lot of data to suggest that children and teens want to know about a parent's illness, in part because they are already observing changes. They understand that something seriously is changing. And other studies that have have asked bereaved children whether they wish they had been told about a parent's impending demise have also similarly, on retrospective reports, noted that they wish they had been told about a parent's terminal illness. Fundamentally, what we think clinically and in terms of our collaboration with parents is that when parents talk to children directly in a way that is age appropriate for them, it allows children to learn about difficult information from a supportive, trusted, and loving parent. And that is a much better way for them to learn about the news and to understand it than perhaps to be surprised either by overhearing it in some way, or to sort of notice some of the changes in the family and be alone with those worries or questions, or to be confused. Also, as parents often think about additional professional support and therapy, for example, talking and communicating and developing a narrative and understanding of what is happening and the ways in which a child and a family is affected is the central and core goal of therapy. So as I noted, one of the core reasons for communicating with children about a parent's illness and diagnosis is to help them understand their experiences. There's a variety of changes that occur in families, as you well know. Having a parent with ALS changes ways in which a parent might interact with a child, how they talk to them, how they play with them. Children can notice changes in parents' emotions. There are also other changes for other family members, including co-parents. For instance, they might notice that a co-parent is taking on responsibilities, for example, driving perhaps, that the other parent used to do. And they wonder about why those changes are occurring. There may also be changes to family routines or certain traditions and rituals around holidays. And all of these changes in interactions, sort of the emotional weather in the family, along with changing roles and expectations for each of the family members, are all things that parents can help children better understand so that they can anticipate what is happening now, but also to plan and anticipate together about what else might change in the future. Additionally, in addition to supporting children in their understanding, communicating with children is also very central to connecting with a variety of other resources and support systems. For instance, it is, communication is certainly a two-way, at the very least, a two-way process. So as much as parents might be communicating about what are some of the changes that the family is experiencing, it is also a way for children to talk about their own thinking or feeling, or to ask some of the questions that they might have been wondering about. One of the ways in which we talk about this in the PACT program is that we say that, communication makes very challenging experiences talk aboutable and then ultimately tolerable. Additionally, some of the other things that we think about as part of our PACT consults that we talk about as, say, social support or community support or extended family support. Communication is a key element of that. So, for example, one of the things we find is that children of all ages, no matter how young or how old, they feel protective of their parents and their feelings. They may be hesitant to ask questions of the parent with ALS, either because they don't want to worry them or embarrass them, or to add to their concerns in some ways. But when parents talk to them, for example, about who are the trusted family members in their extended family or close family friends that they trust, they help them understand who is part of the support system, who else knows about what the family is experiencing. And in a way, it gives children explicit permission to talk to some of the other loved ones and supportive friends and families. And in doing so, allows children and parents to be supported throughout this process. This is a similar process in terms of building the support system and community, for instance, in talking to the school. In communication is central to that process itself. Questions that parents often bring to us is, when do I include school and should I even do it? And we try to think through with them what might be a child's perspective on it. What are the parents' sort of considerations? Who in the school should know and can actively support their children? We also often talk with parents about this concept of what we have over the years in our consultations learned from families. These two terms that I have up here, ministers of information or press secretary, which is sort of a designated person the parents trust, who can help all the well-intentioned supportive friends or extended family learn about ongoing changes. We recognize that communicating can actually take up a lot of time and energy, and in some ways, as important as it is, also places a tremendous amount of demand on parents at times. But it's an important way to keep supportive community members and friends apprised of what the family is experiencing. And so sometimes we talk to families about designating a press secretary or a minister of information, who's sort of the point person to disseminate some of the information to a broader group about the ongoing changes for a family. I think the other thing that I would highlight is that as parents talk both with their children as well as to their extended support children, it is a key way for them not only to support children, but also themselves, because ultimately children's well-being is connected to parents' well-being. And so any investment that you make in supporting yourself and your family is most definitely an investment in your own children's coping and adjustment. So as I said earlier, there is certainly no single right approach to communicating with children. And parents' perspective on communication can be based on a variety of factors. This includes elements that relate specifically to each of their children. So we tailor our consultations and based on a child's age. What's appropriate for a 5-year-old child is certainly very different than what a 15-year-old might want to hear about and learn about. Adolescents and young adults access information online, and they often know and look up information actively online, sometimes even well before parents have had a direct conversation with them. And this is something that comes up with some consistency in our conversations with parents. Personality and temperament styles. Some children ask a lot of questions and want to know more. Other children may prefer to get information in sort of smaller bits and pieces. It might be overwhelming or just feel like too much. And they may need to be supported in a more gradual way to learn some of this information. In addition, a child's sort of prior sort of developmental and mental health history, a family's own prior history is really important in guiding some of our consultations. Particularly initially, but really throughout the course of ALS, we also talk to parents about their own experiences and readiness to have some of these conversations with their children. And like I said, parents' well-being, adjustment, and readiness is central to supporting children. So that is also an element that we think about, as well as their overall parenting philosophy. What might be some cultural considerations, some religious considerations. Each of these factors informs the language and the words that parents use to talk to children about a parent's diagnosis of ALS. We also know from a range of research, particularly with families and parents with a history of cancer, research shows that it can often be easier to share some of the practical information, sort of the factual information about what the diagnosis is, what the symptoms are, what does it mean. But it can often feel harder to talk about the emotional impact. And we like to, we consistently sort of highlight that communication with children includes both of these elements, the practical information, as well as the emotional impact and the emotional information. And that might involve understanding both the child's emotional experience, but also other family members. Ultimately, though, these conversations, parents might be open to talking to children about a parent's illness, but ultimately, one of the biggest questions that parents talk about fearing and worrying about are the most difficult questions, especially relating to the death of a parent. And this can keep parents from talking about ALS in the first place, because initiating that conversation can lead to more questions about, well, if it doesn't get better, then what happens? Some of these conversations, especially questions about death and dying, are particularly occur much earlier in the sort of in the course of illness when children are older. So for adolescents and young adults, these conversations happen almost alongside the initial discussions and conversations about the diagnosis itself. It's often difficult in a talk like this, which is to a very broad audience, for us to really talk about the nuances of how some of these difficult conversations can be done. But I will touch upon some of these details in the talk, and we would be happy to talk further in the Q&A after the talk. But as worrisome as it is, and as heartbreaking as it feels, we do feel that there is a way for families to have these difficult conversations and to reassure children, and to blend honesty with a sense of assurance and hope, including about the terminal nature of ALS. And I will talk a little bit about that in some of the later slides. Some of the key principles that we sort of talk to parents about and that guides our thinking is, as I said, to first and foremost is to check in with parents and to talk to them about their own emotional needs and adjustment. In addition, parents and co-parents often need time, not just to adjust to the news themselves, which is often understandably shocking and potentially traumatic, but also to talk together, to make a plan about how and when they will talk to their children and what might it look like for each of their children, recognizing that children of different ages and temperaments and personality styles might potentially need separate conversations, or perhaps it's a family conversation together. But preparing yourself for these conversations is foundational to having these conversations with children. We talk to parents about how they might prioritize the best times for their family to talk about this. So for instance, it might be a weekend, particularly a weekend where a family doesn't have a lot of additional commitments, and allows them to talk to their children, but then also to see how they are responding through the course of that weekend, what additional questions come up. And sometimes, it might be on a long drive together. There are times when children are more open or families have just more emotional space to talk about these challenging conversations. But overall, we do recommend that parents try to create ongoing opportunities to talk with children without always expecting it. Not all children have lots of questions. In fact, it's sometimes surprising for parents to think or to experience that they, shared this really difficult news, and children didn't say a lot or didn't ask a lot. And even when children know and understand, they may not always want to talk about a parent's illness. There are also lots of times when there are sort of plateaus in terms of a parent's progression, and things are relatively stable. But creating these opportunities is valuable, while also allowing for the flexibility that children may not always want to engage in those conversations. We recommend using, as I said, accurate information, accurate language and age-appropriate language, especially in early conversations about an illness. It can be tempting to use very broad or vague language, like I'm just dealing with a leg problem, or I'm feeling tired. But research from other serious medical conditions does suggest that children cope better when they are given specific information about a parent's illness. And there's some research to show that children may have lower rates of anxiety, in part because they understand what is happening and may be less worried because it's not something that is amorphous or hard to understand. And also because when parents talk to children, implicitly they are giving permission to children that it is okay to talk about this. It is okay to ask questions, and it is not something that is taboo. Parents may also often have to take the lead, and we do recommend that parents consider initiating the conversations, even when children may not have asked anything. And the reason for this is that there is some research to show that many children do not ask questions even when they are observing changes. One way to begin conversations is to start by asking children what they might have noticed. We often find that parents are surprised by how much children have noticed, both in terms of what they might have observed for their parents with the illness, but also just the variety of changes in routines. Um, Children may often talk to parents about, well, I did notice that you've had a lot more doctor's appointments than you normally do. Is that what this is about? It's also an opportunity to correct misperceptions. I'm reminded of a recent conversation with a family where a parent noted that they had stayed home because one of the children was sick with a cold and fever. And the children were aware of the parents' diagnosis of ALS. And one of the assumptions that their children made was that the parents had been staying home because they had ALS, but not because the other sibling had been sick with a cold and fever. So they were making these connections that were not in fact related to a parent's illness. And that's a pretty small example, but there are lots of ways in which children, particularly younger children, may make associations that are in fact unrelated to a parent's illness. So talking with children, asking them what they have noticed, and asking whether they have questions can help to correct any confusions or misperceptions. Ultimately, as a next step, to be able to help them anticipate and plan for immediate changes. So as I noted, welcoming questions, in addition to asking them what they have noticed, and sharing news of a parent's diagnosis, can be very helpful in understanding what types of things children have been wondering about. And we also find that this helps to understand sort of what is the question behind the question. And what I mean by that is, for example, if a child wonders, well, is dad's wheelchair going to be coming soon? And, when a parent sort of explored that question in a little bit more detail and wondered, explained to them when it was coming or when they expected it to arrive, and then wondered why they were asking about that, it turns out that their child was wondering whether a vacation that the family had long since planned during the summer break to visit cousins was still, on track, and whether the family would still travel. So there are ways in which children might have very specific questions in terms of how a family might be planning something, or how they might be affected about it, how they might be affected. And it is sort of, the children's question behind a bigger question. And asking them more about their thinking can help parents to respond more effectively. In addition to communicating medical and sort of information about what ALS might mean, it is also important to attend to the emotional elements, as we said. So certainly using accurate language, naming the illness is important. Similarly, naming the emotions and validating them, and letting them know that you don't want them to worry alone. That it's understandable that they might be worried or sad, that you hope that the parent that the illness will progress slowly. You hope that that while there are acknowledge that there might be changes, but that you still hope and plan to be there at their concert next week, are all ways of acknowledging how you're feeling, but also how children are feeling, and There might be ways, as I said, in which a child may also feel pride about being able to help out in the family or help a parent. And validating this entire range of mixed feelings is important. It helps children develop an emotional vocabulary and language. Um, and as I said, in addition to kind of children's feelings and emotional experience, you might also ask them about what they have noticed for others in the family, or if they have specific worries about school, which comes up pretty consistently. But these are all ways to understand a child's emotional experience and adjustment. Another element that we talk about is that while there are lots of ebbs and flows, and so much of about ALS and its course is uncertain and things that we can't control, um, talking about this helps to balance things that we know, things that can be answered, ways to provide assurance in the ways that a parent will continue to be involved in a child's sort of life, whether it's attending a concert or different sporting events, ways that things might be changing. But also to normalize that there is ongoing uncertainty, that things, what's changing now, what seems to be likely to stay the same, but recognizing that as a family, you need to stay flexible and have maybe a plan A and a plan B. We encourage parents to think about ways in which they can acknowledge what changes have occurred and also to offer assurance, particularly if no major changes are imminent. We do advise parents not to make give assurances or to make promises in ways that really are not realistic, and a promise that a parent cannot keep. A clear example of that is we advise that parents not say that either they will get better or that they know that a few years from now I'm sure that we will be doing this together, or something along the lines that is hard to know and hard to promise. Um, Understandably, as you can imagine, this can impact a child's sort of trust. It can impact the ways in which a child and a family plan for and prepare for changes that could occur, and therefore impact a child's overall understanding and adjustment. It's also helpful to ask children, as I said, um, how much they want to talk about things. Creating opportunities to talk is important, but not all children want that, and not all children want it all the time, or at times when parents want to do it. Um, there may be ways in which parents can and should explore how much to keep talking with each of their children, to provide updates, but then also to ask if they feel like they're hearing too much or if they're hearing just the right amount. But checking in with children, particularly older children, about what it feels okay is important. I'd like to sort of shift gears a little bit with this sort of foundational background to give some concrete examples of ways in which these conversations can occur. So initial conversations, as I said, that sort of are about communicating the initial diagnosis, can sound something along the lines of acknowledging for children some of the changes that are already observable. So saying something along the lines of, you've probably noticed that I've had some falls, that I got hurt, I got some scrapes and bruises. You may have noticed that mom is getting out of breath easily. Or to say that we have been talking to doctors about the weakness in dad's hand. This allows children to sort of connect the dots and to really link the information that a parent might share about some of the changes that children can relate to. Then to connect these, as I said, by describing them in a bit more detail, and then to name it, to say something along the lines of, I've had trouble with my left leg. It feels weaker than before. These problems are part of an illness called ALS. And ALS changes the way the brain talks to different parts of the body. Um, you can go into a lot more details, particularly for older children, and describe for certainly adolescents and young adults whose comprehension is very much like adults, um, in some detail about what this communication pattern is between the brain and different parts of the body through motor neurons, and how the changes in how the brain talks to different parts of the body is leading to some of the weakness and changes in these observable functional symptoms. Um, in addition to sort of describing what children and families are seeing, what it is called, and explaining what ALS is, it's also often helpful, really, for children of all ages, but particularly for younger children, to give concrete analogies of what ALS is. There are sort of different analogies that we've used, and so this may or may not resonate with you, but one concrete way in which younger children in particular could perhaps understand this change in pattern between how the brain and different body parts talk is to talk about the ways in which electrical wires in a house carry signals between, say, a switch and a light or a fan or some other electronic equipment, and talking about the ways in which, just like there's communication when we flip the switch, the electrical wires carry the signals and it leads to this light coming on or coming off. In the same way, the brain can communicate to different parts of the body, and there are these, special messengers or wires or neurons that communicate signals between the brain and different parts of the body. And in ALS, that the way these wires are transmitting the information is changing. Um, in addition to describing what it is, it's also helpful to clarify what it is not. So for younger children, it might sound like, it is not curable. It does not just go away or get better. But my doctors and I will make every effort to take good care of myself for as long as possible. And this is pretty different than, like the cold that, we've all had, or getting a fever. It's not contagious. It doesn't just spread from one person to the other like a cold or a fever. Mom is not just going to get it from me, just, like she can catch a cold or a fever. So it can help to clarify the ways in which it is different from other types of illnesses that children are often familiar with. And younger children might make the assumption that it's similar to, say, a cold or a fever, and in that way make associations that are not active. As I noted earlier, and as I imagine many of you have experienced in some way, adolescents and young adults independently review information online. And there's a variety of information and statistics online. But we also know that ALS can look very different for each person. And so it's actually important to clarify that while it's helpful to know about what ALS is and the statistics associated with it, it may not necessarily apply to your health. Your own personal trajectory is unique. And so clarifying that aspect and encouraging them to ask you questions about your own health and your progression can be really important. And regardless of children's sort of capacity to understand information online, we do think that it is always helpful for children to talk to a trusted adult, a parent, to talk together about what this means for their parent, and it may still be helpful to use some of these analogies. Um, there's also just a range of information online, so not all sources are equally helpful or accurate. Websites may be outdated. So making sure that they are getting information from trusted sources is key, and asking them about what they have read and where, and perhaps even looking together at information online can be helpful. Here I have an example of what a conversation or some of the language for adolescents and young adults might look like. I'm not going to read out all of it, but as you can see here, it has a lot more details. But there is a way in which talking about it together to clarify, say, bulbar symptoms, to talk about how the muscles that help to move the tongue and the jaws or the vocal cords are now getting affected. It can still be helpful for adolescents and young adults, even if they're reading information online, and even if they are understanding a lot of it. Talking to them about it to help them understand your experiences using these words can still be helpful in helping them understand your own illness and progression. After the initial sort of communication about the diagnosis and what it means, talking about what to expect immediately, what are the things that might change right now? So for example, I'm going to keep wearing my foot brace, or I will probably start using a cane just to be safe. Um, Talking about changes that might occur or advice from the medical team. So an example could be talking about how my physical therapist thinks that it's time for me to order a wheelchair. I don't need it yet, and it might take some time to arrive, but I want to be prepared and I want to be able to get around if my walking gets worse. This is an example perhaps of language that you might use to think about helping children anticipate some of the immediate changes or next steps. Subsequently, some of the conversations as you experience more progression or symptoms can sound different and may sound like an example here. I've been falling because ALS has made the muscles in my legs and feet weak, so it's easier for me to trip. I think it's safer for me now to use the wheelchair. You might say something that acknowledges some of the changes in the family routines or the way you interacted with your children. So for example, I miss being one of the coaches for your team. I still enjoy watching you. I will still watch you and coach you in other ways. I love watching you and want to hear all about your games. So this is an example where where a parent might be more reassuring and clarify the ways in which they will still be involved, even if they're not actively coaching their child. To give some examples of how this might differ by age for middle school children and some elementary school age children, as you experience more progression, you might link to prior conversations. So examples might be, remember we talked about how the brain and different parts of the body talk to each other. The brain, for example, can tell the hand to pick up a cup on a table, and the hand can tell the brain, hey, that cup is hot. We talked about those special wires or neurons that help the brain and body parts talk to each other. Well, ALS is now affecting how the brain talks to different parts of my face and my mouth, the way the muscles that move the tongue and lips and jaws. So it is taking much more energy for me to chew and swallow and to talk. Or as mama gets more tired through the day, eating and talking are getting harder. So these are times when we need to be more patient and help her more. And we will do this together. For younger children, say toddlers and younger preschoolers, the information would be much more limited. The young children are still learning about body parts. And starting with brief descriptions about what is changing for the parents might be the primary focus. So saying things like daddy needs to eat slowly, or it is easier for mom to eat applesauce than to bite the apple. Drawing, play, for instance, even doll play, or looking at age appropriate pictures of a body can help to develop an understanding of body parts or how the brain and body parts signal or talk to each other. Children may also be involved in other important conversations. For example, older children may join their parent for the ALS care team's appointments. It can be important and helpful to inform the care team in advance that your child will accompany you. You can plan for how the visit might be structured. You might communicate and ask the team about what types of topics and discussions will occur, and perhaps things that might not be discussed in that visit, and you may schedule something separately, in part because your child is accompanying you. In your own conversation with children, you might acknowledge that participating in visits can bring up a range of feelings, and it can be helpful to process some of that before and after the appointment. I'd also like to give an example of an intervention that parents often talk about in terms of how to prepare children for what changes they might experience in terms of equipment they will see and a medical intervention. So building on some of these foundational conversations, it might sound something like, dad can still eat with us at dinner, but might start choosing softer foods that will go in more easily. And since it is getting hard for dad to chew and swallow, we are talking to the doctor to get something called a G tube placed in dad's stomach. This tube will allow daddy to get the nutrients or food and fluids or hydration that he needs straight to his belly or stomach without having to eat or swallow in his mouth. You might describe what to expect immediately. For example, that dad will go to the hospital to get the G tube, keeping in mind that it's important to leave room for flexibility. So to say it's possible that he might stay overnight and come back tomorrow. It may or may not be a day procedure. And what to expect afterwards. For example, there will be a nurse coming home. Oops, sorry. There will be a nurse coming home in the next few days to help us learn how to use this feeding tube. Children may have questions or worry about whether a parent will be in pain, and parents can reassure children or describe the process by explaining that doctors will give a special medicine or anesthesia before putting the tube. He may feel uncomfortable for a few days or about 2 weeks until his body gets used to the tube. You might want to explain what the different parts of the G tube might look like. For instance, the bag that is connected, to explain that this bag will be connected to the tube. It has a liquid that will give dad the energy and vitamins that he needs. You might explain that a parent may still continue to eat for taste even though they have a G tube. We also sort of think about sort of what other longer term things might change alongside. In this example of a G tube placement, one of the common things that comes up for families and that we talk about is the ways in which holidays and family traditions might change. Eating rituals, food are very central to how we celebrate and get together. And talking, especially around, say, the holiday seasons or major family gatherings or some other traditions a family observes, to talk about what might change. A parent may not be eating the same food, but they're going to still we're all still going to sit together. We're still all going to play those same games that we used to play together, but it is going to be different this year in terms of how we share food and how dad eats. So talking about what will change, but also what will stay the same in some detail to help children anticipate what changes will occur as part of these holidays and traditions can be helpful. Finally, I wanted to sort of give an example of something I sort of acknowledged at the beginning, which is that understandably, parents and families worry about questions about death and dying. What if a child asks, "Will you die?" And I guess I want to finish up this communication section by talking about this difficult question, um, because we think that this is important, even though it's a very complicated question, particularly for a short talk like this for a very broad audience. And some of the examples I share may or may not resonate with you, and that can be difficult in part because it feels unsatisfying. But we still felt that it was important to share examples of what this communication could sound like, ways in which parents can blend transparency with some assurance. And we'd be happy to talk further after the talk about any additional questions that you might have. So as a central theme throughout, we think that there are ways that parents can blend honesty with hope. So to not say to tell the truth about the terminal nature of ALS, that it is not curable right now. And while we can't promise to children that no one will ever die, we can look for ways in which we can perhaps assure children of in a realistic way about what is possible. So examples of that might sound like, there's not a cure for what I have, but no one thinks I'm going to die this week or next month. There's no cure that will take ALS away, but I'm trying to live with it as well as I can for as long as I can. People do die from ALS, but there's a lot that my doctors and I can do to try to manage it, and I'm doing everything that I can. For older children, or subsequent conversations might sound like, we are trying to prepare for changes. Mom or I will continue to talk to you about how I'm feeling, what we learned from the doctors, and how things might change for me and for us. ALS is affecting Dad's breathing a lot. I'm not sure if he will live much longer. We will continue to try and make the most of every day with him. Ultimately, communicating about all of these different changes and challenges together with children and together as a family helps to create a shared family narrative. And these narratives, in many elements which I've described in the last hour, fundamentally help to explain some of the changes, but also to share a family's plan, how they plan to cope with it. And they help to reduce uncertainty and confusion and enhance predictability and coping, while also normalizing and acknowledging uncertainty throughout the process. It includes both factual elements and medical information, but importantly also includes emotional experience for the whole family. It can integrate and highlight your family's, but also your child's ability to cope with very difficult experiences, skills that they may have developed over time, and can convey confidence in their ability to cope through uncertain times. With that, I'd just like to talk very briefly about our current project, that a glimpse of what you saw earlier. This was the project that I had mentioned at the outset, which is funded through ALS Finding a Cure. This is a current project and a future goal for us, where we are developing PACT materials that are on a broad range of topics, and really start from an initial communication about a diagnosis of ALS, a variety of changes and symptoms related to mobility, speech and swallow, breathing, the genetic subtype of ALS, talking with children in terms of how to best include them in caring for a parent, how to think about it and how to include them, talking about anticipated loss, and then planning for legacy leaving, end of life conversations, and bereavement. Throughout these materials, we focus on how parents may support children by being transparent, providing information, and we try to tailor our guidance based on age and some of the other factors that I mentioned that are unique to each family. But these are broad parent guidance materials that will be available freely on our website in both English and Spanish. We have actually developed all of these handouts and materials, and we, as a first step, solicited feedback from our multidisciplinary colleagues in our clinic, but also from families in different parts of the country. We're still in the process of, incorporating feedback, and we would very much appreciate your feedback if you were interested. If you would like to review some of these materials and to provide feedback, please contact us via our program's email, and we'd be happy to talk further with you to see what materials you might be interested in reviewing. There are a number of resources beyond what are listed over here. I particularly want to highlight one of our recent talks by Dr. Cindy Moore through the Muscular Dystrophy Association that is freely available on YouTube. This talk was very much focused on communicating with children. The talk for the MDA provides much more detail about some of the other elements of the PACT model, about changes that parents and children experience, and that might be of interest to you. I suspect you are familiar with some of the resources here, such as Hope Loves Company, that offers virtual support groups and summer camp retreats for children and families. The MGH PACT Program website has a variety of information that is developmentally tailored. There's another tool that we have here is the Lots of Helping Hands website. It's a tool that we sometimes talk to parents about in terms of a lot of the organizational elements that go into thinking about communicating. And then the Family Dinner Project is actually a project out of MGH. It's a separate program, but it has excellent resources for families and many ideas on how to engage children in a dialogue. There are a couple of books highlighted here about how and when to talk to children. In particular, I'd like to highlight the book, Raising an Emotionally Healthy Child When a Parent is Sick. The founder and developer of the PACT program, Dr. Paula Rausch, is one of the co-authors for this book. While there are many ways to find mental health supports, we also know that it can be challenging. And we'd be happy to talk more if there are questions about it, but we wanted to highlight this particular resource, Psychology Today, which is a virtual searchable database of therapists. Thank you so much to all of you, the families with whom we work. We really do consider ourselves to be deeply honored to be entrusted with your family's experiences and to collaborate with you. We'd like to acknowledge our colleagues in our MGH multidisciplinary team. The PACT program is a service we provide to MGH patients at no cost to patients due to the generous support of the EGL Foundation, as well as the ALS FAC We Care initiative that, as I said, also funded the creation of the parent guidance materials. Melissa Enfinger is with the ALS Association, who has been collaborating and helping us to get feedback from families about these parent guidance materials, and we are very grateful for her contributions. Thank you all so much, and we'd be happy to take some questions. I'm going to stop my screen share.
Thank you, Archana. That was very informative. I notice Ron is here with us. Ron Hoffman, our founder. Would you like to say hi, Ron?
Yes, hi. Sorry, I was a few minutes late getting in. I was on the road getting back from New Hampshire. But this is such an extraordinary program. And the work that y'all are doing, it can't be understated. I mean, what I've learned is communication is incredibly necessary. And so many families have such difficulty, especially, many with children. And what the PACT program does, for those of you who are connected, and my hunch is there's one or two of you here hopefully have partaken, because I know you go to MGH. The art of language is so important, how we navigate and share with our kids. The age appropriateness thing is so, so important. I met with a family the other day. The mother, Marianne, passed in 2009. The daughter, who's now, I believe, a junior in college, was just a child. And I remember in this circumstance, there wasn't lots of communication going on. I remember when Mary passed away, the child was stunned. Well, what happened? I was like, oh my goodness. So the importance of how we speak to our kids and what the PACT program can offer, it's just a really wonderful, another level of care and support that Dr. Basu and her team Cindy are offering. So for those of you who have a need for this and who go to MGH, I really encourage you to partake in this. And even if you don't go to MGH, I'm sure the materials are available. So thank you so much for being here. And this is recorded, so this will be available online in our near future for folks to come back to, that we can actually put out to further audience. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Ron, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I said this at the outset to James, but Dr. Moore and I hear pretty consistently from families that we work with about the extraordinary support that CCALS provides. And so we're really honored to be here today. Thank you.
And again, if anyone has a question, please just chime right in. I might have a question for one of my families, if I can ask.
Please.
Dolly, may I ask you a question? Can you unmute?
Yes, you may ask me a question.
Thank you. Can you share how your experience was when your son was younger and how y'all navigated that with him, and the value that you see here in this program?
Sure. So we have two older biological children, and our youngest came to live with us. He was a kinship adoption. He came to live with us when he was 2.5. So he had experienced a significant amount of trauma. So, and I'm a clinical social worker. So we got him into therapy immediately at the trauma center, and we created just normalizing communication and developing, I really appreciated the conversation about developing a feeling word vocabulary and kind of normalizing so that the kids have words. So we did that a lot through our clinical work at the trauma center. We did have initial consultation with Dr. Basu, because he's experienced so many losses in his life. I was really concerned when Doug was diagnosed, how that was going to impact him. And I think having that foundation of being able to talk and creating those opportunities, and I really appreciated your comments about asking them what they notice, as opposed to just jumping in and kind of saying, this is what's going on, because you never know what's going on in a child's head, and you don't want to give them more than, that they could then take in a totally different direction, and kind of, that's not where they were going. So you just want to kind of get a sense of where they're at, and then meet them where they're at and take it from there. But yeah, Charlie, luckily my husband's progressing very slowly. So Charlie has not had to experience a lot of the progression and kind of the setbacks. But I think the foundation that we started early on when he came, but also understanding that the layer of ALS would then put on him, and, just making sure that he had those trusted adults, whether it was outside therapists or his school therapists or his family or other adults in our family or friends of the family that he could go to, because life is complicated, and it's not just ALS that complicates it, but that adds a whole new level. So we're doing well. Charlie's doing well. Thank you, Ron. We're just, unfortunately, he was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So that's a whole nother layer that we're dealing with him on. But I just feel like he's got an amazing sense of resiliency because of, when you talked about, the research shows that kids can have a sense of pride, he's overcoming a lot. And, ALS is one layer of his onion. So anyway, I think we're okay, but it's always important to keep checking in and getting tune-ups when we need them, all of us. So anyway, does that answer your question, Ron?
Indeed. Thank you, Dolly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I know we haven't talked in a while, but I did want to say, sometimes and every now and then we have sort of what I call a biased parent collaborator. And as Dolly said, she's a licensed clinical social worker. So we were on the same page from the beginning, and really she had sort of already started to think about a variety of resources. I felt in many ways we acknowledged that we were talking both in the context of sort of this PACT consultation and had different roles, but in many ways we were colleagues in a different context. So we really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.